If you were scrolling through your audio feed right now looking for something fascinating to listen to, you might actually see a title for this deep dive that looks something like the deep dive. Unbreakable Records and Burning Rinks of the 1919-20 NHL season.
Right, and you'd probably read a description packed with all these SEO keywords about, the chaotic, high-scoring origins of the National Hockey League, or Joe Malone's unbreakable 7-goal record.
Exactly. Or the bizarre rules of the 1920 Stanley Cup Finals, including the Forgotten Rover position and the Ottawa Senators championship run.
And you might just think, oh, that sounds like a really fun bit of wild sports history.
But reading a summary doesn't really prepare you for the actual ground-level chaos of this specific year. So welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you could join us today.
Glad to be here and really excited to unpack this one with you.
I want you to close your eyes for a second and just imagine a professional sports league, like the absolute highest level of competition in its field. Now, imagine a team in this elite league has their home stadium just burned to the ground, forcing them to live completely out of suitcases.
It's wild.
And imagine a player setting an all-time scoring record, right? But when asked about his historic performance, all he can really remember is how bitterly cold it was on the ice.
Yeah, not the glory, just the frostbite.
Right. Oh, and the championship finals, they have to be packed up and moved to an entirely different city right in the middle of the series because it's just, a little too warm outside and the ice is melting.
It paints a picture of really a disorganized pickup league, not a professional operation. But the reality is this was the National Hockey League.
It was, and we are looking specifically at the 1919-20 NHL season today. We're relying on the really comprehensive Wikipedia article detailing this exact stretch of time.
And our mission for this deep dive is to basically cut through those dry statistics. We want to explore how this single, wildly unpredictable four-team season bridged the gap between the chaotic origins of ice hockey and the polished, modern NHL we know today.
Yeah, because to really understand this, we have to set the stage for you. The timeline is late 1919.
Right, so the world is just emerging from the devastation of World War I.
And the NHL itself is barely out of its infancy. It's entering only its third season in existence.
Let's actually start with the business side of things, because looking at the league landscape back then is staggering compared to today. Right now, in this 1919 season, there are only 4 teams in the entire NHL.
Just 4. You have the Ottawa Senators, the Montreal Canadiens, the Quebec Athletics, and Toronto.
Just 4 franchises carrying the entire weight of this professional experiment.
Yeah.
And the instability of those organizations is really something to behold. Take Toronto, for example.
Oh, the Toronto situation is fascinating. The source notes that in December 1919, the NHL approved a name change for the Toronto franchise to the Tecumsehs.
Right.
But then, just a matter of days later, the franchise is transferred from the arena company to a group of private investors.
And this new group immediately renames the club the Toronto St. Patrick's. But what really stands out to you about that transaction?
It has to be the price tag. The historical record shows this group of investors paid the NHL for the franchise, and the cost was exactly $5,000.
$5,000 for a professional hockey franchise.
I mean, to put that into perspective,
Yeah.
Today we are talking about NHL team valuations in the hundreds of millions.
Yeah, with many crossing the billion-dollar mark now.
Exactly. But the business of hockey in 1919 relied entirely on gate receipts.
Right, there were no massive television broadcasting rights.
No global merchandising empires.
No corporate arena sponsors.
Yeah.
You paid the players based on how many people actually walk through the turnstiles on a freezing Tuesday night.
It highlights just how informal and fledgling the business side of the league was, and that instability wasn't just limited to Toronto.
No, definitely not.
The source mentions that Quebec was finally icing a team for the 1919-20 season after actually sitting out the first 2 years of the NHL. What was the holdup there?
Well, that goes back to a man named Percy Quinn. According to our source, the NHL had previously canceled the Quebec franchise because Quinn tried to use it to resurrect a rival league.
The NHA, right?
Exactly, the National Hockey Association, which was essentially the predecessor to the NHL. So when Quebec was finally reinstated by agreement in December 1919, it brought the league back up to that grand total of 4 teams.
But even with just 4 teams, the logistics proved to be a total nightmare. Which brings us to the Montreal Canadiens.
This is such a crazy story.
In April 1919, so during the offseason, their home arena, the Jubilee Rink, burned down, just completely destroyed by fire.
How does a professional team even function without a home rink?
Well, it creates an immediate and severe logistical crisis. Because of the fire, Montreal was forced to play entirely on the road for the first part of the season,
Just think about the physical toll of that. You're traveling by train in 1919,
living out of hotels.
playing in front of hostile crowds every single night without the comfort or routine of home ice.
They were essentially nomads until their new building, the Mount Royal Arena, was finally completed in January 1920.
And when they finally got into that new building, they made absolutely sure the opening night was one for the history books.
Let's pivot to the on-ice action, because this is where the records really start shattering. January 10th, 1920, Montreal opens the brand new Mount Royal Arena against the Toronto St. Patrick's.
And New Zealand decides to celebrate the new barn by scoring 6 goals himself.
Yeah, Montreal drubs Toronto with a final score of 14-7.
And that scoreline isn't just a quirky historical footnote. That combined total of 21 goals in a single game remains an NHL record to this very day.
Over a century later.
Right, in over a century of hockey since that night, with all the advancements in equipment, training, and offensive strategy, no two teams have ever combined to score more goals in an NHL game.
That is staggering, but that wasn't even the most mind-blowing individual performance of the month.
Not even close.
Fast forward just a few weeks to January 31st, 1920. We have Joe Malone of the Quebec Athletics. In one single game, Joe Malone scores 7 goals.
7.
And the source notes an 8th goal was actually disallowed on an offside call.
Which, as of the 2020 update in our source material, still stands as the NHL record for the most goals scored by a player in one game.
It is widely considered one of the truly unbreakable records in professional sports.
You would assume a guy who scores 7 goals in a professional hockey game would talk about how perfectly his stick felt or how he was just reading the goaltender flawlessly.
Right, but when quoted later about his historic performance, Joe Malone simply said, "The thing I recall most vividly is that it was bitterly cold."
It's just a brilliant detail. It strips away the mythology of the era.
It really does. It reminds you that they were playing in conditions we would consider entirely unacceptable for professional athletes today.
They weren't in climate-controlled mega arenas. They were in freezing, drafty buildings, likely trying to keep their extremities from going numb while playing a violently physical game.
But there is a massive statistical paradox when it comes to Joe Malone and those Quebec Athletics.
Oh, the team performance?
Yeah, if Malone is putting up 7 goals in a single night, and the source notes he led the entire league with 39 goals that season, how does his team perform overall?
Well, you'd naturally assume a team with that kind of offensive juggernaut would be a powerhouse. I mean, Malone even almost tied his own 7-goal record later that season, scoring 6 goals in a game against Ottawa on March 10th.
Wow.
But despite having the most lethal score in the sport, the Quebec Athletics were dreadful.
The source shows they went 2-10 in the first half of the season, and 2-10 in the second half. They finished dead last.
How is it possible to have a player scoring nearly 40 goals and still lose almost every game you play?
The answer is hidden in their defensive statistics. While Malone was filling the net at one end of the ice, the team was completely bleeding goals at the other.
They surrendered an NHL record 7.18 goals against per game.
So you're stepping onto the ice mathematically guaranteed to give up at least 7 goals.
Precisely. Their main goaltender, Frank Brophy, played 21 games and gave up 148 goals. That's a 7.1 goals against average.
It is a fascinating contradiction. You have the league's greatest scorer operating within the league's absolute worst defensive structure.
Montreal definitely took advantage of that non-existent Quebec defense. Just to toss in one more absurd scoreline from our source, on March 3, Montreal beat Quebec by a massive margin of 16-3.
16-3.
Yeah, and that stands as the record for the most goals scored by one team in a single game.
The overarching theme of this season really is chaos. The defensive strategies, the goaltending equipment, the rule enforcement, everything was still evolving in real time.
Which leads us perfectly into some of the bizarre roster quirks from that season.
Oh, I have to share this detail from January 24. Ottawa is playing Toronto, and Ottawa's goalie, Clint Benedict, gets penalized.
Now today, if a goalie gets a penalty, a skater goes to the penalty box to serve it, and the goalie stays in the net to protect the team.
Right. But how did it work in 1920?
The rules were far less forgiving. Clint Benedict actually had to leave the crease and serve his own penalty.
So for 2 minutes, Ottawa forward Jack Dara had to play in goal.
A forward, strapping on the heavy goaltender pads right in the middle of a professional game.
And the best part is that Dara didn't surrender any goals during those 2 minutes. He pitched a perfect 2-minute shutout
That's incredible. All of these elements, the massive scores, the forwards playing in goal, the burning rinks, they paint a picture of a sport that is incredibly raw, yet intensely vibrant.
And people were flocking to witness it. The source points out that with World War I now over, players had returned home, and fans were coming out in much larger numbers.
The public was hungry for entertainment after years of global hardship.
We have hard numbers to back up that cultural shift, too. On February 21st, 1920, a record crowd of 8,500 fans packed into the Arena Gardens in Toronto to watch the St. Patrick's play the Ottawa Senators.
Gathering 8,500 people into an indoor arena in 1920 is a massive achievement.
It really is.
It proves that despite the logistical hurdles, the moving franchises, the changing team names, the game of hockey was rapidly capturing the public's imagination. It was validating the sport as a major cultural and economic event.
So, with crowds of 8,500 people buying tickets, you would assume the league owners would want a massive, drawn-out playoff format to maximize their gate receipts.
You would think so.
So how did they actually decide a champion?
They utilized a format you almost never see in major modern sports leagues, a split schedule.
The regular season was divided into a distinct first half and a second half.
And the Ottawa Senators completely dominated. They went 9-3 in the first half. They went 10-2 in the second half.
Because Ottawa won both halves of this split season, the NHL didn't even bother holding a league playoff. Ottawa was automatically crowned the NHL champion.
But being the NHL champion in 1920 didn't mean you automatically won the Stanley Cup.
Right. Who did Ottawa have to play to claim the ultimate prize?
Ottawa had to face the champion of a rival league, the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, or the PCHA.
And their champion was the Seattle Metropolitans.
So the Stanley Cup final was this showdown between the NHL champion from the East and the PCHA champion from the West.
But before the puck even drops, they run into a logistical problem regarding their uniforms.
The source notes that the Seattle Metropolitans wore green, red, and white uniforms. The Ottawa Senators wore black, red, and white.
Someone looked at the ice and realized they looked way too similar.
So Ottawa agreed to wear white sweaters for the series, just so the players could tell each other apart.
But a uniform clash is a minor inconvenience compared to the actual rules of the game. The source mentions games 2 and 4 were played under PCHA rules. What did that actually change on the ice?
It introduced a completely extra position. Under NHL rules, they played the standard six-man setup we see today. But the PCHA rules forced the seventh man onto the ice, the rover.
The rover.
Yeah. This was a player who didn't have a fixed zone, like a left winger or a right defenseman. They simply roamed the ice wherever the play demanded.
So, in a best-of-5 championship series, games 1, 3, and 5 are played under normal NHL rules. But in games 2 and 4, there is suddenly an extra guy flying around the ice.
Imagine the mental agility required from these athletes to completely alter their defensive and offensive strategies from one night to the next.
It speaks volumes about their raw athletic intelligence. They couldn't rely on heavily structured, modern coaching systems or video analysis.
They had to figure out how to adapt to fundamental rule changes on the fly in the middle of a championship series.
And speaking of figuring things out on the fly, remember at the beginning of this deep dive when I asked you to imagine the championship finals being relocated because it was too warm outside?
The ultimate weather interference.
This 5-game series was scheduled to be played entirely in Ottawa, but unseasonably warm weather hit the city.
Because they didn't have the modern climate-controlled systems we take for granted, the warm weather literally melted the ice. It became completely unplayable.
It is incredible to consider the highest prize in the sport being derailed by a warm spring breeze.
So they pack up the entire Stanley Cup final and move the final 2 games to the Arena Gardens in Toronto, where the artificial ice was still intact.
How does this series conclude once they get to Toronto?
Ottawa ultimately wins the series, 3-2. They capped it off with an explosive 6-1 win in Game 5.
And it was Jack Dara, the forward, who had to serve as an emergency goalie earlier in the season, who scored 3 goals in the third period to seal the victory for Ottawa.
A legendary performance to clinch the title.
But wait, what did the actual trophy presentation look like? Because the source outlines a very strange oddity regarding the hardware for this 1920 championship.
Well, nothing was straightforward in 1920. The NHL champion was supposed to be awarded the O'Brien Cup, which was a trophy carried over from the old NHA days.
Okay.
But the O'Brien Cup wasn't actually awarded in 1920.
Why not?
Because the owner of the Montreal Canadiens, a man named George Kennedy, had won it back in 1917. and he simply kept it.
He just hoarded the league championship trophy in his own possession for years.
Essentially, yes. It remained under his control.
That's hilarious.
It wasn't until Kennedy died in 1921 that the NHL finally made arrangements to reclaim the trophy from his estate.
Wow.
When they reinstated it as the official award for the league playoff champions, they retroactively engraved Ottawa's 1920 championship win on it.
So Ottawa won the title, but didn't even get their name on the league trophy until the following year because a rival owner refused to give it back.
That is just the perfect cherry on top of this beautifully chaotic season.
So bringing this all back to you, listening right now, why does a single sports season from over a century ago matter? It matters because it is a stark reminder that the polished, multi-billion-dollar entertainment products we consume today, with their flawless ice surfaces, digital video reviews, and perfectly structured playoff brackets, they didn't just appear out of thin air.
They were built on a precarious foundation of trial, error, burning buildings, missing trophies, and rule-bending chaos.
It really makes you appreciate the deep, unpredictable history baked into every single modern game you watch.
It really does. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Consider the fragile financial foundation of everything we just discussed. A group of investors bought the Toronto franchise for $5,000.
Right.
If those specific local businessmen, or the handful of other owners in Montreal and Ottawa, had decided the investment was too risky, or if that rink fire had bankrupted the Canadiens entirely, does professional hockey even survive the decade?
That's a great point.
We treat the NHL today as an inevitable global superpower. But in 1920, its existence hinged entirely on a few stubborn guys in Eastern Canada willing to lose money on a game played on melting ice.
Yeah.
If those early chaotic investments had failed, would ice hockey have remained a niche regional hobby rather than the international phenomenon it is today? Furthermore, if the highest levels of modern professional sports were still entirely at the mercy of natural weather patterns, how would it fundamentally change the way athletes train, play, and win today?
That is a fascinating question to think about the next time you are watching a game in a perfectly 65-degree arena. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the 1919-20 NHL season. We appreciate you being here, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening. Take care.